Find yourself, everything else is on Google. You may have read this on memes and t-shirts. It's not a joke anymore. It is our reality. Can you live without Google? 2 decades back, we did, all of us. But now it seems almost impossible. If you're a student, you depend on Google for your homework. If you're a news junkie, you read the latest headlines on Google. If you're on the road, you switch to Google Maps. If you plan to eat out, you check for references. If you're traveling, you look for flight options. If you're not feeling up to most of these things, you even check symptoms of what may be wrong with you, though we would not advise that. But you get the point we're making. Google is everyone's Jeeves. Answers to all your questions on your fingertips. For most internet users, Google is the internet. Well, imagine not having it. What happens if you cannot log on to Google? Those of you watching us from Australia should think about this possibility seriously, because Google is threatening to shut its search engine in Australia. No Google search. It is trying to bully and blackmail the government of Australia. Let me tell you the story from the beginning. Australia, the government, wants Google to pay for news. The news that you read on Google, but is not created by Google. It is created by media companies who get no money for creating it. Google uses this content for free and makes money off it. Now, the government of Australia wants this to stop. Last year, it introduced a bill to make Google pay. What did Google do? First tried to push back, then issued a threat. The company says it would much rather switch off Google search in Australia than pay for news. Well, that's bad enough. What's worse is Google's double standards. In France, it has agreed to pay for news. That deal was announced yesterday and we reported it. But when it comes to Australia, Google will not offer a similar deal.
If this version of the code were to become law, it would give us no real choice but to stop making Google search available in Australia. The code's final offer arbitration model with biased criteria presents unmanageable financial and operational risk for Google. In its current form, the code remains unworkable, and if it became law, would hurt not just Google but small publishers, small businesses and the millions of Australians that use our services every day.
It's not just Google that's threatening Australia. Facebook too has issued an ultimatum. This new Australian law affects Facebook as well. They will have to pay for content. So Facebook does not want to do that, of course. Instead, it has vowed to block users from sharing links on Facebook. Clearly, these two companies have ganged up on Australia. The government has refused to relent in the face of these threats. Prime Minister Scott Morrison slammed big tech companies and rejected their latest demands.
Australia makes our rules for things you can do in Australia. That's done in our parliament, it's done by our government, and that's how things work here in Australia. And people who want to work with that in Australia, you're very welcome. But we don't respond to threats.
So this is what Australia is facing, big tech bullying. Why should you care if you do not live in Australia? Because tomorrow it will be about you and your country. The monopoly of tech giants is not limited to one country. This story is not just about Australia or the journalists working in Australia. This story is about setting a precedent for the whole world if Australia pushes this new law. If Australia forces big tech to pay for news, it will set an example for the rest of the world. Other countries could bring in similar laws, and these tech giants know this, which is why they're trying so hard to stop Australia. They have so much to lose. Big tech now dominates the global advertising market. It dominates global advertising revenue. Look at this graph now. There are 9 companies on the list that you see. The top 2 companies are tech giants, Google and Facebook, earning well over $180 billion combined in 2019, $180 billion. Twitter is on number 5 with close to $3 billion in earnings. The rest are traditional media companies. Their earnings are way less than $10 billion. Big tech dominates this market, as I said. And they do it on the back of free content. Google or Facebook pay nothing to the publishers for their stories. They just make money off free content. Google made $4.7 billion from news websites in 2018. According to one claim, this was almost as much as the revenue of the entire online news industry in America. Google alone was making that kind of money. Google has called these numbers inaccurate, but a growing number of governments and stakeholders are now convinced that big tech is profiting off free content. With more people going online, governments around the world believe it is time for tech giants to pay. We told you last night how Google has inked an agreement in France for paying publishers for news. Here's what's happening in the rest of the world. In the United Kingdom, Facebook will pay British news outlets millions of pounds a year to license their articles. In Malaysia, newspaper publishers came together to force tech companies to pay. They want their government to consider bringing in laws like the one being discussed in Australia. Last year, former Prime Minister Leo Varadkar of Ireland said that charging Facebook and Google for news is a good idea. In 2019, the European Union approved new copyright laws for the internet. These changes gave rights to news publishers, musicians, script authors to negotiate payments with Google and with other tech giants. Now the Australian government has decided to force tech giants to pay, and they realize that big tech is crushing the news business in their country by piggybacking on their content. How this fight ends will have a bearing on the whole world. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.